Well, greetings wherever in the world you may be. My name is Stuart Kirk, and it is my privilege to present for Ansible Fest 2021 a beginner's guide to Ansible and Microsoft Azure. First, a overview of myself and a bit of my background. As I said, my name is Stuart Kirk, and I actually work for Microsoft in their global black belt cloud native practice. I focus heavily on application innovation and cloud native technologies. Back in the day, I actually used to work for Red Hat, and I like to go on saying that I am the first RHCA that was ever hired at Microsoft. My hobbies are here, and my social contacts are down at the bottom. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter, GitHub, or LinkedIn. So before we get started, I wanted to extend again, thank you for joining. I know there are a lot of sessions with Ansible Fest 2021, and I am very humbled that you chose to spend some time understanding how to connect your on-premise environment of Ansible to Microsoft Azure. What we're going to do here is we're going to go over some existing slides and talk about the start infrastructure and what that looks like from a desktop workstation point of view, and then how to subsequently connect that existing Ansible environment into Microsoft Azure. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to operate with the assumption that you have a Linux desktop workstation in front of you that doesn't even have the Azure CLI installed on it. So we're going to go through that entire process of actually installing the CLI, building a brand new Ansible host, because we don't want to necessarily work with your production Ansible server that you have running. And then with this new Ansible host that we build, we're going to subsequently create a connection to Microsoft Azure and deploy a virtual machine. So what I'm going to do first in terms of this presentation is kind of go over all of the steps that are required for completing this task start to finish. And the way that I've structured this presentation is in sort of a cookbook format where you can literally do a copy and paste of pretty much everything that you're going to see on these slides and subsequently upload that into your terminal session to connect to Microsoft Azure. What we'll do at that point is switch over to a demo where I will show all of this to you live, and we'll end off the presentation with a few references that you might want to take for future notice. So you're aware, all of the content that I'm presenting today, this recording, the slide deck, all of the text that you're seeing is going to be uploaded into my GitHub, which is going to be on the references slide at the end of this presentation. So feel free to visit that GitHub and download any of this content to replicate in your own environment. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to do on our host is install the Azure Linux CLI. And so basically what this is a Python application that is created by Microsoft, and we create a new Yum repo for this application, as you can see by the second step here. The first step is to import Microsoft's GPG key so that Yum or DNF, whatever you're using, is going to trust the package when you execute the install command. We're then going to subsequently log into the Azure Linux CLI. Actually, I should refer that and call it the Azure CLI for Linux, because the Azure CLI actually can run on Windows, it can run on Mac, it can run on a number of different platforms. So it's not really the Azure Linux CLI, more of the Azure CLI with Linux support. At any rate, we're going to log into that environment. Subsequently, we're going to change the default output of the CLI to table format. By default, the output from the CLI is JSON. And if you're trying to interpret what's happening with a particular command that you've invoked, seeing JSON kind of come across the screen is going to be much more complex than it would be normally if it was in a nice formatted table. So we're going to go ahead and make that change. We'll also have a look at where the Azure data centers are located, and then subsequently create a new resource group for your new Red Hat Enterprise Linux Ansible jump box. And so just for your knowledge, a resource group, think of that as a file folder. And so there, in a Azure subscription, there can be a number of different file folders, and inside those file folders may be things related to virtual machines or network interface cards, or a Azure Red Hat OpenShift instance, or some sort of PaaS service or database or SQL Server or what have you. Resource groups or file folders are a good way to keep all of those resources kind of grouped together for specific projects or applications. So just think of a resource group as a way to organize data within the Azure environment. This is the command to create the jump box. Now, essentially what we're going to be doing today is creating two virtual machines, right? The first one here is going to be done using the Azure Linux CLI, or the Azure CLI for Linux. And we're going to create the jump box using the AZ, or AZ if you're in Canada, command to stand up that virtual machine. We'll subsequently connect to it, but the second virtual machine that we create, we're actually going to have Ansible do that for us. So we have to, make sure we, approach this in a logical fashion. So we're going to head and create the jump box first, load Ansible on it, and then subsequently create the second virtual machine using Ansible. Now, one thing to take note of as part of the connection to Microsoft Azure is the notion of a service principal. So I think most people are familiar with the term service accounts. You create a service account on a Linux host or any machine, really, so that some sort of external appliance or service can connect to that host and pull data that it's entitled to get at. And in most cases, service accounts are very locked down, and they are only granted the absolute least amount of permission they require to accomplish whatever they need to have done. Typically, service accounts are not interactive in terms of a user working with them. They are some sort of automated appliance or third-party service, as I said, connecting and in an automated fashion performing some sort of task on the host. So in this particular case, think of a service principal as a service account. It is a way for users to connect to Microsoft Azure and make third-party applications able to connect to that environment. And so there's 4 components of a service principal. As you can see, this particular slide is laid out showing the 4 different commands that you need to generate that information. And when we go through the demonstration, I'm going to call them out specifically, but you'll see at the end of each of these commands, there's a reference to sp-pass, which is the password, the sp-app ID, which is the application ID that is created for the service principal, the sp sub ID, which is your subscription ID, and then the sp tenant ID, which is the ID for the tenant for your subscription for Azure. So all 4 things together will make up the service principal that will allow Ansible to connect into the Azure environment. What we'll do then is subsequently verify that that virtual machine has been created, copy those files to the virtual machine since we'll need those for our service principal, and then subsequently connect to it and begin to install all of the Ansible components. Now, what you'll see here is an install of Ansible for the first step of this particular slide. However, to make Ansible capable of connecting into Microsoft Azure, we need to make sure that we install the Azure collection from Ansible Galaxy. And so this is called azure.az collection, and simply running the Ansible-Galaxy command to install that will load the appropriate components onto the host in question. What we subsequently will do then is use pip to go ahead and install all of the requirements, which will pull in all of the necessary modules. And subsequently, what we'll do is clone the GitHub, as I mentioned before, I've created for this lab, and subsequently run through the tasks to create the virtual machine as part of this exercise. When we create the virtual machine, which should take roughly about 3 minutes, which is around the same time it takes to create the virtual machine through the Azure Linux CLI, we're going to see a number of tasks being created here. And all of these kind of make sense from an organization and virtual machine perspective. The first thing we're going to do is create a resource group. Remember the file folder reference, which will contain our virtual machine and its components. We'll then subsequently create the virtual network, a subnet within that virtual network, give the virtual machine a public IP address, which we don't have to, but to make it easily accessible in this environment, we'll go ahead and give it a public IP address. Subsequently, we'll create a network security group where we can do some firewall filtering and blocking of ports and whatnot. And then subsequently, a network interface card, which will be kind of the culmination of all of those different components, the public IP, the network security group, virtual net, subnet, all of those are kind of connected into the network interface card, which is then connected to the virtual machine for a build. And at the end of the day, we should see some sort of output that says we're now able to connect to our virtual machine And this playbook here that you're seeing is going to be available on the GitHub again. So feel free to take this build-azure-vm.yaml playbook and repurpose that for your environment. After we're done building the virtual machine, we'll go ahead and connect to it and just verify that it is indeed there. And then we'll subsequently jump back over to our desktop workstation. And then from an Azure CLI perspective, we should now see two virtual machines, as you can see here from the screenshot example, the first one being the jump box that we have subsequently created to host Ansible, and then where it says my first VM for that resource group, that is the virtual machine that Ansible itself has created for us. So those are the two virtual machines we're going to hopefully see at the end of this exercise. So without further ado, let's go ahead and turn over to the demonstration. I'm going to exit out of my PowerPoint presentation here, and I'm going to be working with a host here called AFJump. And I'm going to be assuming that this particular host does not have any sort of Azure Linux CLI installed on it. So I'm going to essentially be doing a great deal of copying and pasting in terms of the different commands that I had shown you as part of the slides. So as you can see here, I'm copying and pasting these commands in, and what is happening is I'm creating a Yum repository and subsequently installing the GPG key for Microsoft applications. This is now going to allow us to install the Azure Linux CLI without having any sort of interruption from Yum or DNF. And at that point, after that's complete, we'll go ahead and log into the CLI using my subscription. Now, in typical cases, you can just specify a username and password right on the command line. In this particular case, I'm going to log in using a device code because I've worked with this before. There's a number of different ways to log in, and you can certainly research those. But I'm going to be using a device code, which you'll see in a moment, to connect to my Azure subscription. So as you can see, the package is almost finished being completed. And after that's done, it is installing it at a global level. As you can see, Yum is installing it as a root user, of course. And so any user that is on this host is subsequently able to make use of this application. And if we type in AZ and hit enter, we can see that this application now exists. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and log into the Azure Linux CLI using the device code. And let me just fix my hyphens here. And so I'm going to copy this code that it gives me, and this is different for every invocation of connecting to the environment. And I will paste that into my browser window and specify my my credentials. At this point, I can close this window out, or I'll just leave it open for now. And it should return back that it has now enabled and given me access to my Azure subscription. So as I had mentioned, the default output for the Azure Linux CLI is JSON format. I'm going to go ahead and execute this command here that is going to revert my output back to table format. So if I do an AZ group list, you'll see the output here is in a nice table format, and that shows me the resource groups that I have available. Now, if I execute the command AZ account list dash locations, we'll see here all of the different Azure locations that exist across the world. There is actually a switch for this command that even shows the coordinates of those locations, I do believe, but we'll leave that for another time. At any rate, what we're going to do is create a new resource group called Ansible Fest 2021 in the East US Azure region. And we're doing this just because that's kind of closest to where I personally live, and we'll use that just for latency's sake. As I mentioned, what we're going to be doing is creating a new host to run Ansible on. And this is being done because we do not want to disrupt any sort of instance of Ansible that you have running in your environment right now. And so what we're doing here is we're building a brand new host. You wouldn't necessarily do this. You might use your existing environment, but just to be safe, I want to create a separate virtual machine to play around with here, so I'm not disrupting any sort of modules that you have installed from Python perspective or anything else on the host that could potentially interfere with what we're doing. So after this virtual machine is completed, we'll go ahead and get some information on it. We'll create our service principal that we talked about a few moments ago, and subsequently connect to that host and make use of all of that data that we've compiled in order to make Ansible aware of Microsoft Azure and connect to the Azure environment. And so the virtual machine should be completed here, but after we go ahead and make the connection, we'll go ahead and run the playbook, and we should hopefully have that second resource group and virtual machine created for us. So as you can see, we have the host completed. It did scroll off the edge of my screen here, but you can see that the IP address and fully qualified domain name are for that host. I'm going to go ahead and save that into a variable here called jumpbox. And so if I just do echo jumpbox, you'll see that it is just that FQDN that's there. And then just to verify what I'm talking about here, we'll do an AZVM list -D. And there's changing my hyphens again, -D. And as you can see, the single host jumpbox is here for us as we've gone ahead and created. So I'm going to go ahead at this point and subsequently start creating the service principal. Now, you'll recall the service principal is what we use to connect the instance of Ansible into our environment. And so there's 4 components to that. The first component that I'm going to create is the actual service principal, and I'm going to save the password to a file called az.sp-pass. Now, as you can see here with this command, when I run it, what's going to happen is it's going to give the output and output that into this file. So if I was to cat this file, sp-pass, we'll see that output. Now that, unfortunately, when the SP is created, that is the only time that the password is visible to us. And therefore, we kind of need to take advantage of that to go ahead and determine what that is and save it to the file in an automated fashion. So that's why I've actually saved the password out of the actual creation command that you see here. So the next command that we're going to determine is the display name of the service principal. And if we go ahead and look at that, what we'll do is we'll cat this out. It's called az-sp app ID. So this display name, which is my username -Ansible Fest, maps to an application ID, as you see here. So this is the second of 4 components that we need for our service principal. Subsequently, we'll move forward and do the same thing for the subscription ID and the tenant ID for our Azure account. And so that has been saved. All of those 4 hashes have been saved in the appropriate files that we'll need for our service principal to become active on our Ansible host. What I'm also doing here is I'm determining what location or what Azure data center that I'm using, and I'm saving that to a file called az.region. And so if I cat that file out, we should see East US, which we do. So what I'm going to do is, at this point, now that we have our jumpbox created, I'm going to copy all of these files to that host because they're not there yet, right? And that's where we're going to make use of them. So I'm going to subsequently copy all of those. And as you can see here, I've done this a few times before, which is why we're seeing the DNS spoofing message coming up. But of course, we don't need to worry about that. We did copy our host files over for the service principal as well as the region. So we've got our 5 files over there. At this point, we can connect over to that jumpbox and start working with it. And let's see here. So let's just go ahead and delete this file. And let's try this again. There we go. That looks better. So we're now on the jumpbox that we set up. And again, this is going to be the host that is used for our Ansible server, right? Again, we don't want to mess around with the production Ansible implementation. So we're going to go ahead and stand up a brand new virtual machine to do this. You may not want to do this, but again, this is just kind of one way to keep things nice and safe. So I'm going to be installing some RPMs here. I'm going to install DRPM, Telnet, Elinks, Python 3, version 3.8, as well as Git. And so after these are installed, we can subsequently move forward and finish setting up the environment using the files that we just uploaded. And after that, we can enable or install Ansible, enable it to connect to Azure, and then run the playbook that we had talked about before. And so this is almost complete. After this is done, what we'll also do is create a SSH key pair. Now, I'm assuming you have an SSH key pair on your original workstation, which is why I didn't create one there. And we don't obviously have one here, so I'm going to go ahead and create one of those right now using this command. So we now have an SSH key pair and an empty passphrase, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create the references in .bash rc for the 4 variables that we talked about. I'm going to then use source and do a source bash rc, and if I check my environment variables, we should see that those are now there, which they are. At this point, we're going to go ahead and use Python or pip to install Ansible. So you can certainly do this, I believe, as well with Yum or DNF. I'm just choosing to use Python here, but whatever makes the most sense for you. This will take a couple of moments to install. And then after this is done, we'll go ahead and subsequently install the modules from Ansible Galaxy, and then clone our GitHub repository and run our playbook that's there. And again, all of the components that are being presented to you today are located in this GitHub. And so feel free, like I said, to connect to this environment and subsequently download any of the data that you need and repurpose it for your own purposes. That's why we have it there, and happy to make that available for everyone, as well as slide deck for the kind of step-by-step instructions that we're going through here. So Ansible is almost finished being installed. It does take a couple of minutes, as I had mentioned. And then the next command that we're going to run is Ansible-Galaxy to go ahead and install the Azure.az collection that will install I guess the requirements file for our modules. I guess that's the best way to say it. It's not the actual modules themselves, but it will tell pip where to go to get all of the modules that it needs to enable Ansible to connect to Azure. So we'll just give this a couple more moments. Unfortunately, I can't do any live editing here, so we'll just have to wait a moment. And this is done. I think we're almost finished here at this point. Hopefully this is a useful exercise for you. We're going to go ahead, as I said, now to run the Ansible Galaxy command. And this actually goes pretty quick in terms of downloading the components that are necessary. However, out of this, what we're going to do is we're going to force install a particular version of PyJWT. And at this point, we will then subsequently execute pip and point it to the requirements-azure.txt file that was installed and have it satisfy all of the modules that it needs. And as you can see them flying across the screen here, we're seeing all sorts of Azure modules. We see Azure management modules. We see PaaS type modules. We see other Azure Key Vault modules. There's OpenShift modules. There's all sorts of different modules that are installed as part of this exercise, and they all come through Ansible Galaxy. So it's really a nice group of components that you see here kind of at the bottom of the screen, all of those modules now being installed so that we're able to make use of them and all of the Azure components. At this point, we'll go ahead and clone our GitHub repository, and we'll switch into that directory. So we'll just do a cd Ansible Fest 2021. If we have a look at the files that are there, there's not many right now, but there's a variables file. There's an initialize script that we're going to go ahead and run that will create our own custom variables file. And then this is the playbook that I had mentioned. So you can feel free to repurpose this for whatever you need for your environment. So at this point, I will initialize our own custom variables file. We will now see I have a myvars file, and that playbook will actually call that file. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and actually run the playbook, and we'll see how long this takes to build the virtual machine for us. As you can see, the Ansible tasks are now running. We're creating a resource group that has already been completed, creating a virtual network, and then a subnet within that virtual network. We'll then create the subsequent public IP address, network security group, network interface card, and then tie all that together with the virtual machine and plugging that in. After that, we should have a virtual machine up and running that we can subsequently SSH to. And I've actually created the code in the Ansible playbook that will determine what the FQDN is for that virtual machine. And it will just allow us to subsequently copy and paste that over to our command prompt to verify that's there. Now, this is obviously a very, very simple explanation of how to create a resource in Azure using Ansible. A virtual machine in and of itself is not that amazing. However, when you think about all the other services that are available from an Azure perspective, and you start seeing how to leverage the code that's part of this playbook to subsequently make use of those other services, it does become very interesting in terms of the different tasks that you can automate and features that you can enable as part of Azure through Ansible. I do have another session that I'm planning on recording and submitting for Ansible Fest, so feel free to have a look at that. That is going to be a much more advanced session talking about deploying applications to Azure Red Hat OpenShift using Ansible, as well as doing some IaaS to PaaS migrations and some much more other advanced topics related to Ansible and Microsoft Azure. You can see we're on the last task here to create the actual virtual machine. And after this is done, as I said, we'll go ahead and create the virtual machine and connect to it. And we will make sure that that virtual machine is there, alive, and we will have a look at some reference slides, reference information and slides that I have for you. So this is almost done here, I would think. And as you can see, I threw the time command on the front of the playbook. So it should tell us roughly how long it took for that to complete when it's finished. So we'll just give this a few more moments, and then we will SSH into the new virtual machine that is there. Again, please remember that I'm running another session with regard to Ansible. Feel free to have a look at that in the catalog, and feel free to join it if your time permits. Certainly those that are doing work with OpenShift or containers and have interest in automating some of that activity with Ansible, it is going to be a great session on how to mitigate some of those responsibilities from a repetitive sort of deployment perspective for you to roll out a new cloud native service. So at this point, the the virtual machine is completed. As you can see, as promised, the FQDN is there, and I'm going to just go ahead and run this now. Because I created an SSH key pair on this jump box, it just used that in terms of creating that virtual machine. So you see, I was just able to SSH to it without specifying a username. It's just assuming that it's using the current username. And so as you can see, I am now on a different host, which is called stkirk-vm. If I exit out of that and then exit it again back to my workstation, I can subsequently run the command that we previously saw, azvm list -d, and you can now see that there are two virtual machines that are there. Again, very similar to the screenshot that we saw a few moments ago in the slides, but we see we have the jump box that was created. This was done through the Azure Linux CLI, and then the subsequent virtual machine that is here that was done from Ansible. I'm also going to do an AZ group list, and as you can see, I have my resource group Ansible Fest 2021, but I also have another resource group called My First VM. This is also a resource group that Ansible created. So very good. We'll finish back off with some references here. There are a number of different links at the bottom of some of the slides that point to some reference points of Microsoft documentation with how to create a service principal, how to work with the Azure CLI, how to work with Ansible Galaxy, and then very importantly, a list of all of the Ansible modules for Microsoft Azure. And this is actually a very good link because all of the different modules that are there, I'm actually going to visit it here really quick. It will show you examples on how to execute each of these modules and how to write code for them. So it's very, very interesting. As you can see, it is very diverse in terms of the different components of what you can interact with on Microsoft Azure for the different Ansible modules. In terms of like a Cosmos DB deployment, you can see all of the different parameters that exist within that module. But if you scroll down to the bottom of this documentation, this applies for every single one. You will see sample playbook code that you will need to create these resources in your Azure subscription. And so feel free to leverage these snippets of playbook code, which are tasks, of course, to deploy whatever service you're looking for on Microsoft Azure using Ansible. So very, very exciting. As I had mentioned here, we have a number of different references. Again, at the top of the slide, that is the reference to my GitHub. My GitHub name is STUART at Microsoft, and the repo name is just Ansible Fest 2021. I hope this presentation has been insightful for you and helps you move forward with connecting your on-premise environment to Microsoft Azure. I'd like to thank you for your attention today and really appreciate your attention. Understand that there are a number of different sessions. Again, very humbled that you chose to listen to this one. Please do reach out if you have any questions through any of the social links that you see here on this screen, and wishing you a very good and successful Ansible Fest. Thank you so much.